Alright, today I'm going to be discussing the pros and cons of major guitar bridges. I'm going to be talking about the four major types of bridges that I personally own: the fixed bridge, the double locking bridge, the vintage style trem, and the Evertune. Just real quick, I am just a guy on the internet who likes guitars, as you can clearly see. I do the casual online music thing. I have my music on YouTube videos and on streaming services like Spotify. But I'm not a virtuoso, I'm not in any amazing touring band, and I am not sponsored by any of the brands shown in this video, okay? So first let's talk about the fixed bridge. This is the most basic bridge you can get on a guitar. This bridge is the easiest to set up and won't cause any crazy issues if anything goes awry. So to tune it, it's super easy. You just tune each string at the headstock. Perfect for beginners. And also perfect for those experienced players who want a simple experience or need something simple and robust. There will also be no major catastrophes if you break a string, because there's nothing going on besides just a piece of metal here on the wood. You break one string, it's completely independent of all the others. All the others will stay in tune. Great for live scenarios. Of course, the strings will pitch drift if you hit them really hard, so have some restraint when you're picking. Don't pick with all your strength. This can be said for most bridges except for the Evertune. More on that later. Of course, because you only have the bridge, the strings going through it, the nut, and then the tuners, if you play really hard and heavy, it will go out of tune. This is for various reasons. This particular guitar does have the locking tuners, but maybe the strings will slip at the tuning posts. Maybe the strings will bind on the nut if you have a low-cost nut or you didn't lubricate the nut. And there is nut lubricant. You can also do a trick where you take like a mechanical pencil, like the graphite, the lead of that, and you kind of rub it in between the slots. That does help lubricate a little bit. It's a nice little trick. But because it's so simple, it will go out of tune if you play really hard. And that could be just because of your playing technique, or because maybe you're feeling adrenaline because you're playing in front of people, or you're feeling adrenaline because you're playing in front of a camera, or you're trying to get that perfect recording take and you're trying really hard and you just play a little too hard and it does go a little bit out of tune. Not saying it will go out of tune instantly if you hit a string, just one string really too hard. Just letting you know, kind of splitting hairs for the sake of the discussion of this video, that if you play really hard, it will kind of slip out of tune a little bit. It might bind in the nut. It might slip out of the tuning heads. But a major pro of this kind of guitar with this kind of bridge is that there's no springs in the back that you're fighting against. There's no spring equilibrium that we'll get into later. It's just basically the wood of the guitar, the middle of the bridge, and then the nut and the tuning heads. So when you bend a string or when you're playing and you add vibrato, it's just the feel of that string versus the guitar body, nothing else. You're not feeling any kind of springy feel. And also the sound of the guitar, the feel of the guitar, it will be as resonant as the body wood is. Believing in tone wood or not, if the guitar is resonant, the strings will feel resonant. There'll be no spongy feel. Now let's move on to the next type of bridge, the double locking bridge. So that'll be your Floyd Rose style bridge, that'll be your Ibanez edge bridge, your edge low pro bridge, etc., your Goto bridges, things like that. As long as you have the strings locking both at the bridge and at the nut, the locking nut. So because it's a double locking system, you won't have any string slippage at the bridge and especially at the nut. You can't bind the strings at the nut if the nut is locked. So that already solves that problem right there. And of course, because you're locking at the nut and at the bridge, when you lock it down, it does go sometimes a little sharp. You can fine tune at the bridge, but also when you need slight tuning adjustments, you can also use the fine tuners right there. So that is pretty nice. You don't have to sit there kind of really doing delicate adjustments at the headstock, which is not the end of the world, which isn't a great hardship, but it is kind of nice. Of course, one major con though is due to the nature of how it works, you do have springs in the back of the guitar. So the string tension and the spring tension is at a constant equilibrium. That's how it stays in tune. But that means if you break any one of these strings, if you're playing really hard and you break a string like the high E string, that's going to disrupt this equilibrium and the whole thing will go out of tune if you break one string. Recall on the fixed bridge, that isn't a problem because there is no equilibrium in the back. It's just the string right into the body. But if you break a string on the double locking system, just any one, then it's game over. And that's particularly a problem because when you're tuning too, if one string is out of tune, the rest fall out of tune. So you can't just put a string in, tune it up real quick and go like you would on a fixed bridge. As you know, new strings, they need stretching. So you put a new string on, you tune it up real quick. Even if it is then perfectly in tune, the string will stretch a bit and then everything will fall out of tune. It's basically not viable to switch strings on a floating bridge. You'd have to bring a backup guitar in case you do break a string on stage if you're playing live. That would be the safest way. Of course, because there's that equilibrium between string tension and spring tension, you do also feel a bit of springiness when you're bending the strings or you're doing some vibrato, because there's those springs in there against the bridge. So if you like the feel of a fixed bridge, it's going to feel a bit differently if you're playing a bridge like this. So you have to keep that in mind, because feel when you're playing might not matter to the audience, of course, but it matters to you as the guitarist. These are tools for our trade. We're trying to make music with these. Whatever works for us, the right tool for the job is very important. So if it feels bad to you and you're the one trying to make the music, that might be a non-starter. Of course, it's not all doom and gloom. People do like this bridge, and for good reason too. It is extremely stable if you get the setup right, if the strings are all stretched, if the tuning is right. It will stay in tune for a very long time. Like I mentioned earlier, it won't bind on the nut, so you're not going to have any tuning stability problems there. The tuners, like slipping through the tuning posts, is completely irrelevant once you lock down the nut. Some people do prefer locking tuners because when you're restringing, it will hold the strings in the post. Whether you love locking tuners or hate them, be sure to comment down below. I'm sure you will. Once you get those in tune and lock the nut, it won't matter anymore. But yeah, it'll stay in tune once you get the setup right. You can bend, you can do dive bombs up and down, and it'll be just fine. Of course, getting that set up does have kind of a steep learning curve because you have to know everything about the setup. You have to understand intonation, you have to understand tuning each string one at a time, you have to understand setting up the springs in the back, tightening or loosening the claw that holds the springs. There's a lot to learn for this, so for beginners it's really difficult. So if this is your first guitar and you're not ready for the challenge, that might be something to keep in mind. Of course, because there's those springs, because it's not just wood, it does have a tone block in the back. So this will be as resonant as that tone block is. Of course, it's nice that there is a tone block. And it's also nice that the whole system, the springs, the claw, the tone block, it does add some weight. So in many cases, in many designs, it does make for a perfectly balanced guitar like this one. But what if you had a bridge on a fulcrum that didn't have a locking nut? Let's talk about the more vintage style tremolo, like you would see on a Stratocaster or a Strat type guitar. They are of course easy enough to restring, because you don't have any kind of crazy locking nut. You just feed the strings through the tuning heads. And this kind of bridge is on a lot of guitars. It's very common. My first guitar was kind of a Strat clone, and it had this type of bridge with the springs in the back, as you can kind of see. No locking nut and just the tuners. Of course, because it has the springs in the back, it does have that equilibrium. So as your ear gets more refined, you will hear it goes out of tune when you tune one string and the other falls out. So you do have to learn that kind of tuning technique where you tune one, the next one you go back, so on and so forth. So it's not the super simplest bridge to tune like a fixed bridge. It doesn't quite have such a steep learning curve as the double locking bridge, because you could just keep tuning it. You don't have to know about locking the nut and then retuning and then fine tuners and all that. But unless you slam the bridge down to be flush with the body, like if you have it in floating mode, you will have to understand the principles of a floating bridge, the whole string tension, spring tension, equilibrium, things like that. And of course, if you are using the whammy bar, I don't have it on this guitar right now, but if you're using the whammy bar a lot for dive bombs, things like that, you will have to understand it will bind in the nut, stuff like that, if you don't lubricate the nut, if you don't do the mechanical pencil graphite trick or lubricate the nut. And it can slip through the tuning heads unless you have locking tuners like this guitar does. So it will never be as stable as a perfectly set up double locking guitar, but it's also less complicated than a double locking guitar. Many people do prefer this type of bridge for those reasons. And maybe they do like the feel. Like the more vintage ones I'm not really a fan of, but the more modern vintage style tremolos, they do start to feel better. They did improve their ergonomics. Definitely try one out. But if you're the kind of person who loves whammy tricks, up and down, dive bombs, crazy bending harmonics and chords, vibratos with your right hand, things like that, you might want to consider a double locking tremolo. And again, because it's strings versus springs, you're going to be just as resonant as the tone block you have in the back. Alright, let's talk about the Evertune bridge. So the Evertune here, the whole point of the Evertune is to hold the strings in tune at any cost. And I'm happy to report that it actually works. Of course, it's not magic, it's a mechanical system. You've got your bridge right here, you've got the springs, one spring per string. It's not completely flawless, it's not magic, but it does work. It will drift out of tune eventually, but it holds tune much longer than anything else. And you can set it up to be able to bend the notes because it does hold notes in tune even if you bend the string, which is really trippy to use, especially if you have a bad habit of adding vibrato and lots of string bends all the time. But how it works, it's basically a spring per string, so to get it into the bend zone, you almost bottom it out with the string tension. You kind of quote unquote tune it right here. You actually tune it right here, but you can get it to that bend zone up here by tightening the string, and then you're basically bottoming it out to bend the strings. So you get the best of both worlds there, but that does mean you have a little more tension than you're used to. So if you have a very tired hand, a very inflamed hand, maybe you've had long days at work, maybe you're getting on in the years, this might be a bit more difficult to play. It took me some getting used to. And then of course, because it is a spring per string, this is the most springy experience you can have. So it'll be the most different from the fixed bridge. And it'll also have just the least sustain because there is no sustain block, even though it has a spring system. So it will feel the most disconnected from the wood of the body. But it's unparalleled in tuning stability. You can easily intonate it. It's kind of quite as easy as setting up a fixed bridge. You are using the same tool for tuning as you are for the string height and the intonation, so that's really nice. So in that way, it's easier to set up than a fixed bridge. But you do have to know what you're doing, so it is then a little bit tougher. It's super easy for a beginner to try and use this bridge, and then mechanically it can get stuck, and then they won't know how to debug it. You have to loosen the tuners all the way and then bring it back, and that'll unstick it. And for a beginner, they're just trying to learn the pentatonic scale, the major scale. So doing something like that might be beyond them. Or someone who doesn't regularly set up their guitars or know how to do that, knowing what to do on a bridge like this might be a bit tricky. But again, it is the same tool for everything, so maybe this is the perfect tool to learn. Personally, I already knew how to set up a guitar when I got a bridge like this, so it wasn't a problem for me. So, could be easy. But because you can just set up the intonation and it holds the tuning so well, this guitar will sound amazing on recording. So if you're doing a lot of recordings, you're going to be really thankful that you'll have a guitar that'll stay in tune, that you won't have to tune after every take, after every other take, etc. That'll stay in tune. Maybe you're practicing in a warm environment, then you go play a show in a cold environment. You won't have to worry about things falling out of tune from the neck shifting from the different temperatures, things like that, because you have a tool like this. So it is just the epitome of, maybe it might feel weird at first, but it is the ultimate tool for sounding good because you're in tune. So you're watching this video, which one do I prefer? Well, the fixed bridge is nice. I do like the stability of a fixed bridge, but because I do a lot of recording, I need things in tune. Having a double locking tremolo that is blocked is kind of the best of both worlds, because you have no binding at the nut. You have a super solid bridge that won't move, and you do have those fine tuners. So because of that, the blocked double locking bridge is one of my favorites. But if I could only pick one, just one to do everything with, staying in tune and being intonated would be the most important for my recordings and putting that music online for people to hear. So I probably would pick the Evertune if I could only have one guitar. I mean, obviously, I can't pick just one guitar. You can see all these guitars behind me. I do appreciate every single bridge. I'm not hating against any one of them, but if I could only have one, this would be the most useful for me for my uses. But remember, if you can find a bridge that works for you and you love the feel and you love the sound and you love using it, that's the most important, because these are tools to make music. These are tools of our trade. And finding the right tool for the job is very important. So there you have it. Did I answer questions? Do you have anything else? Is there something I left out? Be sure to comment down below. This is YouTube. I have to say the YouTube things. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share the video, print out every frame and mail it. Give it to random people on the street. And as always, peace.